Hi, and welcome to yet another fun and informative session on human resources management. So over the past couple of months, we've been looking at a raft of employment law areas that you need to be aware of as an employer in terms of your rights and your responsibilities. We've looked at entitlements and also processes and policies. So today we're going to be looking at a very specific area in quite a lot of depth, and this is an area that there are a lot of misconceptions, a lot of myths about, and this is the area of long service leave. So what you find out today may surprise and maybe even upset you. If that's the case, I want you to feel free to email me any questions or queries that you've got. westlink@rdl.wa.gov.au. That's the email address where you can send any concerns about today's session or any of the sessions that we do on human resources management. So in terms of long service leave, what we're going to be looking at is who is entitled to long service leave in Western Australia. Now the answer to that may really surprise you. We're going to look at continuous service and how that's important to long service leave, when it breaks and when it doesn't. We're going to look at the calculation. So how do you calculate long service leave? How does it accrue? And when you need to pay it out, how do you work that out? We're also going to look in quite a lot of depth about taking long service leave, about the methods of payment, about how that can be worked out between the employer and the employee. So firstly, a bit of a general overview of long service leave. The current entitlement is 8 2/3 weeks after 10 years of continuous service. Now the reason that that's a little bit of a funny number there is that it used to be 13 weeks after 15 years. About 7 years ago now it is actually, they changed that so that employees could access it earlier. They didn't change the accrual rate though, so that's why it comes out at a slightly strange number of 8 2/3 weeks after 10 years. But essentially it's a bit over 2 months of extra leave on top of any other leave that that employee has accrued over that time. The other thing to be aware of, and this may surprise you, is that it is accrued by all employees. That includes full-timers, part-timers, and casual employees. It's really important to realize that if a casual works for a business for long enough, they will be entitled to take long service leave when that 10-year point falls due. It also applies to people who work on commission or get paid bonus rates. They are also entitled to long service leave. And the final basic thing to be aware of with long service leave is that it is paid out pro rata on termination after 7 years. So that means that regardless of who ends the employment relationship, whether the employee leaves or the employer terminates the employee, if they work for more than 7 years but less than 10, they haven't actually reached that point where they can take long service leave, but they get paid out a portion of that, or a percentage of that, depending on how many years they worked with their final pay. That's something that applies, again, to all employees, whether they're full-time, part-time, or casual. So now we're going to look at continuous service. So this is basically, continuous service is the period of time that someone spends at one business without a break of employment. We're going to look at the absences from work that count towards long service leave and the absences that don't. So firstly, the absences that do count towards long service leave. Any period that an employee spends on annual leave, long service leave, or public holidays, that time will count towards their accrual of long service leave. Any time that someone spends on sick leave, but that's only to the extent of 15 working days in any 1 year. Now I'm going to go into a bit more detail about what that actually means a bit later in the presentation. Any period following a termination by the employer, if that termination has been made merely with the intention of avoiding long service leave. That's a bit of a complicated statement, but basically what that means, if someone is terminated solely so that the employer does not have to pay long service leave, for example, if someone is terminated very, very close to their accrual date of long service leave, that would be considered, that would not, I guess, absolve the employer of their entitlement to pay long service leave. The Long Service Leave Act is very, very strict in making sure that employers cannot avoid long service leave entitlements through terminating the employee. The other thing to be aware of is any period that the employee spends with the defense forces. So any period that someone spends with the Navy or the military, that will actually count towards their long service leave entitlement. That's, I suppose, not as common as it used to be, but it's still an important thing to be aware of. All right, now we're going to look at continuous service. We're going to look at breaks in service that do not break continuous service, but they don't count towards long service leave. So they will not restart someone's entitlement to long service leave, but they won't actually count towards it. These include, these are pretty broad. This includes any absence authorized by the employer. What we're looking at there really is unpaid leave. Any unpaid period of leave that the employer has allowed the employee to go on will not count towards their long service leave entitlement, but it won't break their service with the business. Any reasonable absence on legitimate union business. That will still, again, will not count towards, but will not break continuous service. Any transmission of business. So that means if the business changes hands, if one employer buys the business off another employer, that time spent between the two businesses will not break someone's continuous service. We're going to go into transmission of business in a bit more detail later in the presentation. Any termination by the employer on the grounds of slackness of trade, where the employee is rehired within 6 months. So that means that any redundancies, essentially, any employment termination that happens because the employer could not continue to keep that employee on, if they are then rehired within 6 months, that period where they were not working for the business won't break that long service leave, but it won't count towards it either. And then there is any other termination for any reason where the employee is re-employed within 2 months. So regardless of the reason of termination, if someone is rehired with that same business within 2 months of that termination, they will then continue to accrue long service leave as though that break hadn't happened. So that's continuous service. If you've got any queries about that or anything that we talk about in today's presentation, please feel free to email westlink@rdl.wa.gov.au. All right, I talked before about sick leave and how that affects someone's long service leave entitlement. Essentially, if someone takes up to 15 working days of sick leave during any given year, that time will count towards their long service leave. However, any extra sick leave that they take during that year, it will not break their continuous service, but it will cease to count towards long service leave. So anything in excess of 15 days of sick leave in any given year will not count towards someone's long service leave, but it still won't break that continuous service with the business. The calculation. So this is how do you work out how much long service leave someone is entitled to after 10 years when they want to take it. Essentially, it's 0.8667 times the completed number of years of service. That will give you how many weeks of long service leave are owed. That is how many, 0.8667 is how much, the percentage of a week that someone will accrue during any given year of service with the business. Now, if someone is leaving the business after 7 years but before 10 years, you've actually got to also take into account any incomplete years. So if someone was to work 7.5 years, you'd have to take into account that full 7 years and also the 6 months after that full 7 years. That would all be taken into account in terms of someone's long service leave accrual. If you've got any queries about that, it's probably best to call WageLine. They can talk you through the calculation in a bit more detail. All right, now we're going to look a little bit about taking long service leave. So basically this is the arrangements that an employer and an employee can come to in terms of taking, granting, cashing out, and paying for long service leave. The Act is very thorough in dealing with this, and that's good because it actually gives people a lot of flexibility and a lot of scope in how they want to work out someone taking long service leave. Firstly, provided that agreement is reached between the employer and the employee, long service leave is to be granted and taken as soon as is reasonably possible after it falls due. So basically that means as soon as long service leave falls due, it's up to the employer and the employee to work out the best time for both parties for the employee to take that time. It can be taken in one continuous stretch, or it can be taken in separate instances, but that cannot be less than 1 week at a time. Where the employee has been entitled to long service leave for more than 12 months, they can give the employer 2 weeks' notice that they wish to take that long service leave, and the employer cannot refuse such a request. So once someone's had their long service leave due to them for more than a year, if nothing has been agreed to by the employer and the employee can then give that notice and they are allowed to take that long service leave after that period. In terms of payment for long service leave, as a general rule, the employee will be paid at the rate that they were being paid at the time that leave fell due. Their rate of pay at that time is what they will be paid long service leave at. There is one exception to this rule, and that's if the employer and the employee agree to postpone the leave to meet the convenience of the employee. What that means is, say someone reaches their point of long service leave, and the employer says, well, I'd like you to take it as soon as is possible for you to relieve me of that debt. And the employee says, well, actually, no, I'd rather wait 2 or 3 years because I'm going to get married and I want to use it for my honeymoon or something like that. Any pay rises that have happened between that point and the employee going on that long service leave will not apply to their long service leave entitlement. It will stay at the rate that they were being paid at the time that particular arrangement was struck. So that's the only time that they will not be paid for at the rate at which when the leave fell due. In any other circumstance, if nothing has been arranged or the long service leave is postponed to meet the convenience of the employer, they will be paid at the rate that they are being paid at the time they take it. Okay, now we're going to look at, I guess, the rate that someone is paid. So we're looking at ordinary pay. What does that actually mean under the Legislation Act? It essentially means their base hourly rate. It's not going to include any overtime payments, it won't include penalty rates, it won't include allowances, but it will include commissions or bonus payments where that's relevant. That will actually be taken into account if they are receiving those payments as part of their work. If they are paid by results, so they get piece rates or bonus work or commission payments, the rate of pay while on long service leave will be the average weekly rate earned over the preceding 12 months. So essentially, you would take what that employee earned over that previous year, divide it by 52, work out a weekly rate, and that would be the weekly rate they would receive for their long service leave payments. As I say, if there's any queries that you've got, you can email Westlink at rdl.wa.gov.au. Continuing with the theme of payment for long service leave, now this is a very tricky area that can really drive employers insane in a lot of ways. I'm going to talk about employees whose hours have varied over the course of their employment. If someone works full-time, it's very easy to work out what they have to be paid for long service leave because it's their 38 hours per week that they get paid at. But if someone is part-time or casual and their hours have varied over the course of their employment, what an employer is required to do is to work out the average number of hours that they've worked per week over the entire period of employment and pay them at that rate. Now, there are ways that we can work that out that aren't as strenuous as that sounds, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But essentially, at the base, the black letter of the law is an employer has to work out how many hours has that employee worked on average per week and pay them long service leave at that rate. In terms of how that payment is made, it's very, very broad. There's a lot of options that the employer and the employee have. Most often, it's paid as though the employee was working. So it's paid at the normal way that it was in the course of the employment. If it's requested in writing by the employee, the employer can actually pay out that amount before the leave commences. But also, it can be done by any other method agreed to by the employer and the employee. That agreement has to be in writing, but basically that gives the employer and the employee a lot of scope to work out the payment that works best for them. Now we're going to look at just basically some, I guess, sundry areas, some various areas of employment of long service leave that everyone should be aware of in case this comes up. Firstly, public holidays. If a public holiday falls during a period of long service leave, that will extend the employee's entitlement by 1 day. That's only if they would have worked that day normally. So if someone's part-time and they wouldn't have normally worked on the day that public holiday falls, that will not extend their long service leave, but in any other case, it will. We're now going to look a bit at taking long service leave in advance. So this means that the employer and the employee can actually agree that the employee takes long service leave before they become entitled to it. What will happen if the employment is then terminated before the employee has reached that entitlement that they've taken? The employer can actually deduct the difference from their final pay. So for example, if someone has been working 6 years and the employer very generously grants them 10 years worth of long service leave, but then they only work 8 years, and up to that 8 years the employee leaves, if the 2 weeks worth that they haven't actually accrued, that they have been paid for, can be deducted from their final pay. I would really, really strongly recommend that you seek some advice if that situation comes up, just to make sure that you are covering yourself as an employer and that you're not taking anything that you're not allowed to take out of someone's pay. Now, we talked before about the payment for long service leave and how broad and flexible that is. Another way that we can look at this is cashing out long service leave, the ability to actually pay out long service leave rather than take it. Now, with most other leave, with personal leave, you can never cash out personal leave. With annual leave, it's very strict and very specific, the areas that you can cash out annual leave. With long service leave, it's actually a lot easier for an employer and an employee to agree to that. The Act allows for a written agreement to be made by which the employee forfeits their long service leave as long as they receive an adequate benefit in lieu of that. What that essentially means is that if someone is paid out their long service leave they're paid out the money amount that they would have received otherwise, that could be considered an adequate benefit in lieu of actually taking their long service leave. This is, as I say, it's very rare that leave is allowed to be cashed out, but long service leave is one area where you can do that. Now there's two reasons why this is very useful for an employer to be aware of. One, if it is an area where the employee wants to cash it out, an employer can do that. Secondly, before we talked about employees whose hours have varied over the course of their employment. Now, if someone has worked for 10, 20, 30 years, working varied hours for all that period of time, it might be difficult or maybe even impossible for the employer to even find all the employment records that prove how many hours that person has worked over the entire course of their employment. The cashing out provision of the Long Service Leave Act allows for an employer and an employee to strike an agreement and say, well, we're pretty satisfied that it was more or less this number of hours. You worked on average 20 hours over the course of your employment. We can't prove that that's exactly what it is, but we're both happy that that's about what it was. And then you can pay that adequate benefit in lieu, and if there's a written agreement in place, that will be fine. So there isn't the same risk in terms of paying that entitlement there are attached to other areas of employment law. Another area to be aware of, separately, is that it is prohibited for an employee to be employed during long service leave. So they cannot engage in paid employment that is the substitute for their, the employment for which they are on long service leave. If they are found to be doing this, an employee can actually forfeit their long service leave entitlement. So that's something to be aware of, that someone can't engage in paid employment that's the substitute for the job that they're being paid long service leave for. I'm going to briefly talk about long service leave and buying a business. Now, I've talked about this a little bit previously, but just to reiterate, if someone buys a business and they keep the staff of that business on, any long service leave that they have accrued with the previous owner comes with them. It transfers with their buying. So regardless of what's worked out in the sales contract, regardless of what you tell the employees, the Long Service Leave Act places the obligation of paying long service leave on the employer that is employing those employees when they take that leave. So it's really, really important if you're buying a business and you're taking staff on that you're aware of how long have they worked for that business. Because if they've been working for 6 years and they leave a year into their employment with you, you are now responsible for the entire leave that they've accrued over that period of service to that business. So it's very important to be aware of how long have they actually worked for that business before you've bought it. All right, well that basically covers my talk on long service leave. So just to, I guess, sum up, we've looked at who is entitled to long service leave in WA, and the answer is more or less everyone who works for long enough to receive that entitlement. We've looked at continuous service, the absences that break continuous service, and also the absences that don't. We've looked at the calculation for long service leave, and we've also looked at taking, granting, cashing out, and paying for long service leave. So if you've got any queries, once again, please do feel free to email Westlink at rdl.wa.gov.au. Before we go, I just want to, as I always do, plug the WageLine call center service. So WageLine is a free, confidential, and unbiased service. If you've got any queries, particularly on long service leave, please do feel free to give them a call, and they can talk you through the calculation. They can give you more detailed information about taking, cashing out and paying for long service leave, and they can also send you out any written information that you require about long service leave. Finally, I've just got to do my little disclaimer. This is a very general overview only, and you should always seek specific professional advice before acting or not acting on the information in this presentation. So once again, please do feel free to email that email address if you've got any queries, Westlink at rdl.wa.gov.au. And in the meantime, thank you very much.